we'll have a psalm meditation on Psalm 74. Now, Psalm 74 is a psalm of Asaph, and Asaph was one of David's seers. And as I was thinking about this psalm, I was reminded of the second commandment and what the second commandment requires of us. And many students and Christians I've taught in the past, when I've asked them about the commandments, and I said, what's the first commandment all about? And they say, well, you don't worship any other gods, right? It's just God alone, nothing else. I say, yeah, solid, good, right? And I say, what's the second commandment about? All right, remember the second commandment? No what? No idols, right? Yeah, no idols. And I say, well, what's that mean? They say, well, you shouldn't, put anything above God. Don't worship money and all these other things. And I say, wait a second. I thought that was the first commandment, right? Don't worship anything other than God. I go, oh, that's right? So I say, what's the difference between the first commandment and the second commandment? And the answer is the second commandment assumes the first commandment, right? So it's like you got the first one, okay, that's in place. Don't worship anything but God. So the second one must be about something different. So it's not worshiping, again, only God, but it's the way you worship God. That's where the idolatry comes in. You're to worship God as he is and not as you just imagine him to be. That's what an idol is. It doesn't have to be a gross physical idol. Any misconception of God is an idol. So, in other words, God is jealous and will guard his name. What you attribute to him, what you call him, how you say he is. And in this psalm, it mentions your name 4 different times as an emphasis. Like God's name is to be protected. Okay? It has a similar theme of many psalms where there's a situation identified and then explained, and then a request for God to do work for salvation, and then a hopeful ending based on God's work in the past. And it kind of ends there. And so while that theme we've talked about many times, there's just some particulars I'd like to point out in this psalm as we go through. Notice at the beginning when he says, "Oh God, why have you rejected us forever?" This is an example of the psalmist's perception. The perception is that you can feel that God has rejected you, and then you just wonder when it's going to end. But of course, the reality is that you are not rejected by God, even though you might feel that way. I've never liked the phrase perception is reality. It's always bothered me, right? I understand what people mean by that when they talk about, well, when it comes to like how you're engaging with someone and you might be perceived a certain way and for them that's the reality. But then it's kind of taken a life of its own. And now it's just like, yeah, that the perception is the reality, when that's plainly false, right? You could just think in your own life many times you thought something was the case. That was what you perceived. It turned out to be totally different. That was the reality. So perception is not reality, and how we view and feel about God or our relationship with God is not necessarily reality. Have you ever felt unsaved? Have you ever felt too sinful to be saved? Have you ever felt at enmity with God? Have you ever felt kind of bored with God and not terribly interested? And yeah, I imagine we've all felt those things and more. But that didn't change your state, didn't change the fact that you were redeemed by God and you were called his own child, although you might not feel it in the moment. And this is what he calls upon in the rest of that verse. Why does your anger smoke against the sheep of your pasture? And then he says in verse 2, remember your congregation, which you have purchased of old, which you have redeemed to be the tribe of your inheritance, and this Mount Zion where you have dwelt. So he's calling upon the covenant relationship that he and others have with God. That's the source of him calling upon God. What God has done, not what we do. So this is a right way, this is an appropriate way to approach God, based on his goodness and word and promises to us. In verses 3 through 8 and pretty much all the way down to 11, he talks about the situation with the wicked. And things have physically, there's some physical sort of metaphors of really the spiritual reality, which is the worst thing that can happen You feel forsaken if God is taking away his temple, his meeting place, and here he talks about the prophets. There's no prophet, there's no one to speak to us. That's when things are as bad as they can be. When the spiritual blessings are being taken away. So next time you're inclined to worry or be concerned about things you don't have, ask yourself, what's the state of my spiritual blessings? How are those taken from me? Have those ever been taken from me? And if you can say, no, I always have all of God, and nothing changes that, then guess what? You're beyond measure blessed. Not minimizing all the struggles in my life or your life, not at all, but we got to put it in perspective. And the psalmist here is bringing out the most important elements, the religious focus. True judgment comes when spiritual blessings are removed. So we can be very thankful and blessed at all that we have, even just here at Christ the King. And notice in verse 12 through 17, he has maybe we call it a Job realization, right? He comes to understand who God is and who he's talking to. And that's important to set our minds right. We constantly, daily, sometimes hourly, minute by minute, have to have our minds renewed and transformed and set right. Because we can easily go to misconceptions about God, violating the second commandment. And there's two big ones that I thought about, I was meditating on. You can view God as the hammer or the genie. Both are wrong. The genie is, if I just do all the good things, I get all the blessings. Right? A equals B, right? I do this, God gives me this. That's the genie mentality. Okay? The other is the hammer. Things are going so good. When's it going to end? It's going to fall any second. I know it. Things have just been going too well. Got the good job, relationship's going well, health's going well, and any day you're just waiting to wake up to something. That is a false conception of God too. As if you think that God cannot just pour abundant blessing upon blessing upon blessing upon you. I'm not saying there's not discipline, and we're prepared for that, but it would be mistaken to think of God as the genie or as the hammer, as opposed to the loving Father as the scripture describes him. Okay. And then in the last few verses again, in verse 18 and 21, he talks again about his name being praised. And he calls upon the Lord to defend his name. Again, that's the reason that God would work, not necessarily for us, but to defend his good name. And I was thinking, and I mentioned to Pastor Anderson, I don't know if it was maybe about 2 weeks ago, I think, when he was talking about the Garden of Gethsemane, and they come and ask him, are you Jesus? Right? And he says, I am he. And it says how they fell back. And I always thought about that, like, why do they fall down? Like, that seems, you Jesus? Yeah, I'm Jesus. They just fall, right? And it's interesting because in our English translation, it says, I am he, and it's probably a proper translation, given the context there. But really what he says to them is, I am. Ego e me, right? He is the I am. He is the God of, the Old Testament who spoke to Moses out of the bush. And I think there was something powerful about these people encountering the incarnate living God and hearing him say those words to knock them back. So God is jealous and powerful to protect his name. And this is something we should constantly seek to uphold and uplift and not care about ourselves and our witness in our lives. We simply live to lift up the name of God. And lastly, he calls upon him to act. And it seems here he's asking him to do as he's done before and nothing more. And that's a good reminder to us when we come and ask God. We're praising him for what he's done in the past, and we're simply asking him to do what he's already done and showed us, to continually be good and merciful to us. So we'll stand now and we'll sing Psalm 74a, singing the truths of the Lord back to him. Please stand.